Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.
So I'm going to raise a lot of questions about how we even engage and confront some of the issues that we've been confronting, but in particular looking at consciousness. And I'm going to hit on four kind of problematizing areas, and I'm not going to have any answers, just lots of questions. And I'm going to first talk about concepts and conceptual frameworks to get us going. And then I want to talk about a distinction that comes from anthropology between debates that they had about ethics and emics and the relevance that has for various approaches to the topic of consciousness, both in philosophy, theology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, artificial intelligence. And then I'm going to look at some rival ways of thinking about the criteria for confirming a particular conception of consciousness against rivals. So one thing is to recognize that there are rival concepts of consciousness. It's another question of how does one even approach affirming one's own to the exclusion of other rival accounts. And then I'm going to give some examples of some of these conflicting concepts. And I'm not going to solve any of the answers to them. I'm more going to lay out a lot of other alternatives. And I think some of them are going to be quite familiar based on some of the rival concepts of consciousness that we've encountered so far over the last 2 days, but also some that haven't been brought up yet. A starting point here is a contention that scientific experimentation of various kinds requires the operationalization of our definitions or concepts, something from our conceptual framework. If you want to do a study of episodic memory in a corvid, you're going to have some account of what episodic memory is. You're going to have some criteria for how you identify it. You're maybe going to have a task description of how you're going to operationalize your idea of episodic memory, and you're going to run a model in a corvid. Maybe you're going to try to run a similar model based on things you found in the rodent literature. Maybe you're going to look at some of the dementia literature as well and see how they've tried to operationalize the idea of episodic memory. These sort of translational disciplines try to look at a concept and they try to figure out different ways of operationalizing them. So one of the first things to be claimed here is that to have rigorous scientific experiments also requires conceptual clarity, to be really clear about the concepts we use. And these concepts have histories, they have lineage, they have rival ways in which they progress, they develop, there are ruptures in our understandings of them. And it's important to sort of appreciate those differences, but what I'm going to be focusing on is what would it be to try to arrive at a rigorous concept, especially a rigorous concept of consciousness, one that can be operationalized in these different areas. An important thing to realize is that there might not be homogeneous, unitary concepts of consciousness. Just with the last panel, it might not be the case that there is a homogeneous, unitary idea of intelligence or cognition or information processing or consciousness that goes across these variety of areas. I mean, it's worth the pursuit of that. I'm not just excluding from the outset the exclusion that there might be a unitary one that we can abstract from all of them, but it's also an assumption to think that there automatically has to be some natural kind that clearly captures all of these different things. That's as much an empirical question as any of the other questions are as to whether or not we're going to find some natural kind of consciousness that is found across the board to all these areas, including intelligence or something like that. So my contentious heuristic here is something like no ontology or experimental operations without prior perspicuous phenomenology. And that's meant to be more contentious than I think we're always in the mix of things and we have to run experiments and we have to make ontological assumptions. But it's always a good thing to step back every once in a while and ask reflective phenomenological questions of why do we think the way we think about consciousness and the way that we've operationalized it so far, the sort of metaphysical commitments we think it has. So sort of not literally stopping and starting square one again, but actually reflecting on how did we get to where we're at so far, and do we still have sufficient justification to continue using things now that we've learned the things we've learned so far. So what qualifies as a rigorous conceptual framework? First, I'm going to present a brief idea of just what concepts are, because the two things I want to focus on are concepts of consciousness, but I want to first say what I mean by concepts. I don't really want to hang myself on this particular concept of concepts, but this is one that I'm going to throw out there. Concepts aren't the same as language. I think concepts can embody different linguistic expressions. So the same concept will find itself filtered through different languages, but concepts can be continuous. It's the sort of common factor that we often are translating between from, say, English into German or something like that. But by concepts, I mean acquired rational capacities. So I want to think of them more as ability-like rather than static content-like. So concepts are more like an ability to be able to engage in a kind of discourse. When you've acquired certain sort of concepts about machine learning, it's not just this static content. It's now a new ability to come and speak a kind of way, interact with it, and rationally engage in the kind of questions that are relevant. It might be taking on a new kind of form of life. And these capacities that we acquire, they govern the ways we understand, articulate what we understand about, among other things, things like consciousness or experiences of things. Another contentious claim here is that I don't think all conceptual understanding is necessarily theoretical understanding. There's a host of concepts that we slowly and gradually develop as children that aren't necessarily theoretical concepts. Theoretical concepts are acquiring sets of capacities where you try in an idealized way to asymptotically reach towards a systematic, rigorous way of defining all the concepts with respect to each other. But the ordinary day-to-day pragmatic worldview ways in which concepts shape the way we look at the world aren't theoretical in that sense, at least. Importantly, though, our ordinary concepts are influenced by theories of concepts. So all sorts of ranges of ways in which genetics has become a part of everyday speech, the way in which people can talk about genetics loosely. They're not speaking it in a rigorous theoretical way, but those theories have come to influence ordinary conversations. And there's a host of other things. Just think about the way that people can talk about oncology and they can talk about cancer treatment. And a range of theoretical discoveries were required in order for those to become parts of everyday understanding of ourselves. But the ordinary everyday way in which those seep into our ordinary concepts are not exactly the same as the rigorously theoretically defined ones. And the last point I want to make is that these practices of theoretical inquiry, where we actually try, as we've been doing over the last 2 days, to develop our own views about concepts of artificial intelligence, concepts of theoretical concepts of consciousness, we're a rather peculiar bunch of people to be doing that kind of activity. That theoretical practices of conceptual reflection are unusual, both phylogenetically for human beings. Not all human beings engage in practices of theoretical inquiry and reflection. And even those of us that have done it, do it out of some point. And in other words, we have a long life that we live before we even learn how to begin to engage in theoretical practices of inquiry. And those long-term commitments that we have prior to our advanced studies continue to influence the ways in which we engage in our theoretical inquiries. So our theoretical inquiries don't exist out of nowhere and don't give rise out of nowhere. They have histories that are related to a range of things that are not theoretical. So the first heuristic I want to focus on about concepts and conceptual frameworks is historical heuristic. It's always important to think about historical origins and developments of a concept or concepts. And once again, it's important to not conceal from ourselves the way in which these concepts have very complicated histories, and what they get translated into can sometimes be lost, things from the origin source. So we were talking about intelligence a bit ago, and what I would comment on is that the way Plato and Aristotle talk about nous or episteme. Nous is often translated as intelligence or insight, but what they mean by that and what Plato means is not the same thing as what Aristotle means, and it's certainly not the same thing that artificial intelligence thinkers mean by that. And when Aristotle and Plato's Greek gets translated into Arabic, and we get ilm and we get akal for nous and for episteme, what they mean by these concepts have a very complicated history. What Al-Farabi and Avicenna and Al-Ghazali mean by these concepts is not the same as what some of the Ash'arites and the other Mutakallimin mean by them. And then when they get translated into Latin, both from the Greek as well as from the Arabic, as scientia, from which we later get the English word science, or intellectus, from which we get the later word in English of intellect, Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, they have different views about these concepts themselves that have very little to do with what artificial intelligence is doing. So just the criteria of how they're understanding these concepts and how they're being deployed here today, it's just a radical equivocation. There's some ways in which they're overlapping, but there's a range of ways in which the history of us teaches us that these are very different kinds of concepts, and we shouldn't assume that they're sort of a homogeneous, unitary, natural kind. So getting clear about those differences on the foregrounding them can help us then move forward to actually trying to do constructive and perspicuous forms of comparative analysis, because there are overlapping comparisons, but I think we also need to be just as clear about the very fundamental differences at the outset. what we need to do, though, I think, is recognize that, interestingly, a lot of these concepts have a late history. Consciousness is not something that admits of an articulate discourse until relatively late in Western history. However, the phenomenon of being aware, of being conscious, this does occur relatively early. So you're not going to find in Plato and Aristotle really systematic, articulate discourse about consciousness. Avicenna, unusually, as we're going to see in a second, actually does have some sort of discourse about consciousness, and he's rather peculiar in doing that. So there's a difference between recognizing some phenomenon and then having a systematic, articulate discourse for actually talking about it. And this point I'm making about conceptual clarity and rigor doesn't just apply to operationalizing our concepts in science. It also applies in hermeneutics. It applies when we're reading historical texts. So whatever you think are the psychological facts right now about consciousness, which are going to be influenced by the theories that you've encountered or the ordinary conversations you've encountered or how much Proust or how much James Joyce you've read, those are all going to influence how you think about consciousness, so that when you come back and look at a 11th century text by Avicenna and read it, you're going to bring with you a lot of the ways of what you think are the psychological possibilities for how Avicenna could be talking about consciousness. And you need to be careful about how much you're reading those into there, or if your own limited understanding of the psychological facts of consciousness are quite limited, that will be an impediment hermeneutically for you to even understand what Avicenna is talking about here. So there's a way in which that has a symmetry between the two. So I want to start with this medieval case of Avicenna's famous flying man example. And I want to ask, how can we read this text? What do we need to know already about ourselves in order to engage hermeneutically to interpret Avicenna's text? It's too long, so I won't read it all to you, but I will tell you about what the flying man is. And the picture there is of this recent monograph on it, which is very helpful in telling some of the story I'm telling about what exactly is going on in the work, but also how Avicenna's thought experiment was received in different ontological and phenomenological traditions within the Islamic tradition as well. A variety of different Asharite theologians as well as Uzlar philosophers who interpreted Avicenna in very different ways than Avicenna himself wanted to be, thought his own view was. So what Avicenna imagines is this case that imagine if you were created and you were suspended in a completely sort of black space. Your hands are completely extended, your limbs are extended, you can't touch yourself. You can't see because it's completely dark, there's no sounds whatsoever, there's nothing to smell, there's nothing to taste. It's a complete state of entirely sensory deprivation. Now in Avicenna's own view, he thinks that imagination and memory are fed from information from the senses. So if the senses are utterly deprived right at your creation, and you're a full, mature human being at this point, you won't have anything to imagine. You won't have anything to remember because your senses are deprived, so there won't be anything in imagination and memory. But Avicenna also thinks that akal, the intellect, the way in which we're getting our knowledge, in some sense, comes out of sensation. So we're deprived of sensation, so we're deprived of imagination and memory and what he calls wahm, what he calls estimation, cogitation, as well as intellectual understanding. We're utterly deprived of any sort of cognitive understanding or information from the world. But yet, nevertheless, Avicenna thinks you would be aware of yourself. You would be aware that you exist, independently from all these other factors. It's really tricky to know what Avicenna means here. What kind of account of consciousness does he have in mind here? Does he even have an account of consciousness? Is it very misleading to think of that? Later on, we're going to come back to 3 different contemporary views about consciousness, and I'm not going to resolve this particular problem about Avicenna. What I want to say is on the face of it, this is already an English translation, so that's already going to take us pretty far away from what the Arabic is saying, and there's already a lot of interpretation going on in each of the key words in Arabic that are being brought over into the English. But all these questions are just as relevant for how we engage in scientific operationalization as well as in hermeneutics of classical texts, getting clear about our own understanding of our concepts of consciousness. So from whence comes these conflicting conceptions of consciousness? Here I want to shift now to some anthropological concerns. The way in which both our approach to historical texts as well as the way in which contemporary sciences and philosophy need to think more anthropologically, or that's at least my contention. They need to think much more about the ways in which both their own development from the kind of education they've received has provided them with genuine resources. But their education is very different from someone else's education, which has provided them with perhaps different resources. And one needs to be able to appreciate why the limitations of one's own educational trajectory is not thereby simply a limitation, that there are other ways of transcending those limitations. And what's an important, helpful concept that comes from the debates that anthropologists had to deal with in the 20th century, this started off as a debate in anthropology working in language, but is a distinction that's known as the emic-etic distinction, or sometimes actors' categories and analyst categories. Ethics here is the application of our theories in analyzing others' behavior and institutions, whereas emics is the interpretations of others' worldviews as they appear to them. So ethics is, the problem was that anthropologists, the students of anthropology, they learned all these fascinating theories when they were in their graduate studies, and then they go out in the field and they make witchcraft have to fit into whatever the fashionable theory is of that, and only that. And they sort of bulldoze over the data and make it all fit a sort of theory. Emics is the idea of how do these people themselves understand whatever practices that are going on there. Now, the claim here is that, following Nick Jardin and others, and he's applying this distinction to the history of sciences, is that you can't settle for one or the other. Borrowing a line from Kant, or transforming a famous line from Kant, he's saying that the ethics, the theoretical approach, those are always going to be empty without some form of emics. You need the local way of understanding things to the best of your ability. On the other hand, you can't have just pure emics. You can't, the idea of going completely native, so to speak, is a bit of a self-deception as well. You need to have ethics that are informed by emics, but you can't just have emics. They would be blind without the theoretical insights of ethics. I'm making something similar here about consciousness and the concepts of consciousness. In one sense, we've all been brought up in different forms of theoretical reflection on consciousness, and we will bring those to the ways in which we think about ordinary people, either in laboratory settings or the way in which we want to simulate them. But we also need to try to reflect on the way in which we ask our questions in experiments is already privileging a certain sort of theoretical conception that might be occluding from our vision other aspects of consciousness or their lives, that by virtue of the kind of questions we ask, we're preventing ourselves from seeing these aspects of the data. Another factor that needs to be addressed related to this anthropological issue is perhaps some of you are familiar with this recent BBS paper in 2010 about the weirdest people in the world. Weirdness here means Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic subjects. Nearly all the psychological, sociological research we have, and this is often due to institutional pressures to publish, and so you go to the quickest people available, and who are those? Desperate undergraduates who need 20 pounds or 10 pounds, so they'll volunteer to do an experiment. And then we make generalizations about how our psychological research is generalizable to all of Homo sapiens. But in fact, our data is mostly looking at individuals who are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic students who are probably from ages 18 to 22. And what they're looking at is the wide varieties in this paper, of the wide ranges of sort of research in this area, and how this is in fact the least representative population of humans ever. And yet we're taking this to be the standpoint of our data set for our generalizations of what all Homo sapiens have been like. So this is another area where we're not reflecting enough about the kind of people we're focusing on and tailoring our generalizations to the kind of data set we have. It's another way in which anthropology can help inform and make better our approach to some of these questions and challenges. Well, I was going to go into some detail in this garment analogy, but I won't do that because it'll take too long. But the only idea is that here is that what we should think about in terms of our ethics, our theoretical concepts, as well as emics, is that in a certain analogy with garments, that different garments that we wear, clothing we wear, armor that we wear, they have different functions and utilities, and we try on lots of different ones, and they might be uncomfortable initially, but they serve the purpose well, and we have to adjust to them. And a certain kind of conceptual therapy is sometimes here required to become more comfortable with alternative concepts. So we might appeal to our intuitions, and we're often encouraged to do that, to appeal to intuitions for reasons for excluding something or defending something. But intuitions also have a social story. They're mostly due to sociological factors. They're types of group thinking. They can be very resourceful, rich, and rationally justifiable forms of group thinking, but we need to be clear if that's the kind of group thinking that we have, that it's rationally justified, or it's just the way that everyone else thinks that way, and because we wanted to fit into the conversation, it was the only way to publish in the field, we adopted that kind of language, and that's why we think this way, and our intuitions get bootstrapped in that kind of sociological way without necessary deep rational reflection. So the idea here I have about garments in this analogy is that it doesn't work to say this concept of consciousness is wrong because I don't have intuitions for that or because it doesn't seem to fit my own experience. It takes considerable more work to try on the conceptual therapy of these rival alternative views and then find a grounds from which one can reject it. But the appeal to intuitions might just be sort of sociological exculpations. They might give you excuses for why you think this way, but they don't provide rational justifications. So what we want are rationally reflective conclusions. So what criteria does one use to endorse or reject rival conceptual frameworks of consciousness or anything for that matter? So here I'm shifting my third section on criteria for confirming conception of consciousness. So there are a lot of rival views about truth, and I'm not going to defend the view that I'm putting up here, but it's an account of truth where our rational understanding, our concepts improve. And I'm thinking of concepts like abilities. They're developmental. They're things that are constantly developing as we acquire new concepts and ability. We have to rethink how our concepts can incorporate this range of new things that we've come to understand. So concepts need to be understood in a developmental way, largely connected with and continuous with the history of ideas, the way in which ideas aren't just one thing. They have an important history of development, sometimes one of rupture, sometimes one of progress. So the idea of truth, though, that I have is an account of making the most adequate conceptual understanding that we can arrive at so far for the way things seem to be to us. And here, drawing on some features from the work of Alcester McIntyre and Charles Taylor, I want to draw attention to three factors that I think are helpful for thinking through what would be required for at least confirming thus far, one's own conceptual framework, or reasons for why one should put in question why you think the way you think about consciousness so far. And I'm going to heading these under types of sociological self-knowledge. So what do I know about myself and my own concepts of consciousness? And how have I maybe not considered certain sociological factors that would cause me to rethink or rationally revisit some of the ways I think about my concepts of consciousness? So the first is a point about fallibilism, then a point about radical objections that are concealed from one's view, and then a point about liabilities to misunderstandings and various pathologies. So the idea of fallibilism is that one is not completely on firm ground on what one thinks to be true. You can say that you think this is true, and you can think, in fact, that it's a necessary truth. But fallibilism also allows for one to say that it's a necessary truth, and I think it's a necessary truth, but I also recognize the grounds under which it might be wrong. Okay? So the idea is that because we're developing socially dependent animals who engage in dependent practices of inquiry, we're finite inquirers, we need to always acknowledge how radically incomplete our inquiries are. There's always a lot more questions to ask, a lot more data to consider, and ways in which that new data might introduce new questions to ask that revise what we've thought so far. But part of the claim here about fallibilism is that in order to assert something is true, to take a stand on something, one should do their best to also articulate the vulnerability of what would make it false. So if I want to make a claim is true, can I also articulate adequately the kind of things that I think that would seriously, not superficially, like substantively, what are the things that would make what I'm saying false? It's very difficult. There are a whole host of things that we just take for granted as stands that shape our worldview, our practices, and our theoretical inquiries. Trying more and more as a form of self-knowledge is an ideal to try to articulate what exactly would make this false. And that will give one much greater security in why they still think it's true. The second point is that because of the stands we come from, because of the tacit or explicit criteria by which our inquiries are shaped, our inquiries perform forms of selective reading, selective forms of relevance. If you endorse a certain kind of view, you just naturally already exclude other views as just not being even relevant. They inform your reading habits. As finite beings, we have to have this kind of selective criteria that helps us sift through why certain things are relevant, why things are salient affordances for us rather than things that aren't of interest to us. But we need to reflect on those every once in a while and think, in what ways are my commitments and stands tacitly causing me to exclude the most fundamental objections to my view? So this is connected to this point about fallibilism. If I want to assert the truth, I also need to know how to make myself vulnerable to the things that could make it false. But if part of my commitments exclude me from ever taking seriously the most radically different views, I've also concealed from my view the ways in which there are serious objections that could fundamentally put my view, could falsify it. First off, there are different kinds of conflicts and stands that we take that we need to evaluate and the differences of them. And here I've just outlined roughly 4. First, there are conflicts of everyday life in our worldviews. And here, just to give some psychological examples, in the World Cup, there were quite a few times where there were commentators and others arguing about handballs. And this is a kind of folk psychology that's legitimately folk psychology, not what theorists say is folk psychology, but a genuine imic, a genuine case where commentators have various psychological views about what they think is an intentional arm movement to a handball and football and what is not. And those were debates where you could actually capture ordinary plain persons debating about the psychology of an intentional action, not some folk psychological theory. You might also have, just disagreements with family members with a grandmother who has dementia and going and visiting her and whether she really recognized someone or not. But what's interesting about our kinds of conflicts and stands we take in our everyday practices in our worldview, those are the questions that eventually give rise to theoretical forms of inquiry. And they cause us and inspire different stances that we want to take. So I would think of theology as a type of systematic reflection on commitments of one's worldview about God, certain views that you might have as a matter of faith, and theology is a sort of systematic reflection on those beliefs. Different views in ethics are going to be theoretical reflections based upon what one thinks is the right kind of actions in some particular circumstance, and so on and so forth. But these give rise then to different types of theoretical stances. The first kind of conflict that we have in theories are conflicts within a theory itself. So you might have a particular set of Avicennian philosophers, and they're disagreeing about a particular sort of issue in Avicennian philosophy. That would be this first kind of disagreement. Or there are people who work on mesolimbic dopamine and whether it's involved in motivation or whether it's involved in reward, and they have largely the same set of theoretical concepts about how they approach this. That's the first kind of conflict and debate that occurs. What is often concealed from view is we think most debates occur in that way, where we're really largely coming from the same perspective. We literally largely have a lot of the same forms of agreement, and so we think all the concepts basically function in the same sort of way. What I would suggest is the kind of question we asked a second ago about AI and these various traditions, or intelligence in AI versus intelligence and some of these theological traditions. We need to be careful to recognize whether or not that's more of this second kind of theoretical disagreement, one that occurs between not necessarily rival traditions, but sometimes rival traditions, views that are just have completely different conceptual frameworks for how they're even understanding this. And so appreciating those differences are very important for even moving forward and how we can engage in our conflicts by knowing where we actually agree with each other and don't agree with each other. I'll skip the last one. The last one is the really radical kinds of disagreements. So most of these views would agree that theoretical inquiry is oriented towards truth. But there are some people who don't even think theoretical inquiry is a pursuit of truth. It might instead be a kind of mask for a will to power or something along those lines. And so that would be a very different kind of view to engage on those grounds. So some questions we can ask here about how to avoid these radical objections that we conceal from ourselves is, what is my point of departure? And here's 2 very different points of departure. There are a lot of different points of departure, and I'm going to mention 2. This is the first one. Depending on the kind of theoretical inquiry one's engaged in, especially with respect to consciousness, you might ask, do I see the task of inquiry is to situate humans or minds or cognition or consciousness within a world as described by theoretical physics? Is that your starting point? And if that is, you're going to have a lot of fundamental disagreements and not be able to make much progress with someone who holds this next view, which is the task of my inquiry to make sense of humans by situating them within the world described by ethnography and anthropology, including the ethnography of scientific practices. So you can't really have much substantive agreement on micro issues until you've really wrestled with these sorts of issues, unless you're just going to be willingly, imaginatively engaged as if you held one of these two views and then could move around in that space. So just asking that kind of question, what do you think you're doing when you're asking about consciousness? Are you trying to fit consciousness within the world of theoretical physics? That's the starting point. Or do you want to make sense of consciousness in the way anthropologists and ethnographers talk about different people groups and how all of them may or may not be conscious in various ways? Another stand that you need to ask yourself as a theorist is, what's my stand on neutrality, objectivity, and theoretical views from nowhere? Is your ideal of what is it to be objective is to have a view from nowhere, a view that can see everything imperfectly, and that's what objectivity is? Is that objectivity is a kind of neutrality that sees all of these views from nowhere? And so in other words, objectivity is the kind of transcending of all traditions or sociologies of inquiry, that you can exceed all the institutional forms of human understanding and somehow transcend them and have a view of objectivity or absolute neutrality? Or do you think that it's epistemically deceptive to think one can entirely transcend all traditions of inquiry? And even within that last view, the second view, that everyone is within a tradition of inquiry or rival or multiple traditions of inquiry, you're always asking questions from within a social point of view. Even within that, there's two different kinds of views that you might answer there. So you might say there's just no truth to be known. It's just a plurality of perspectives, and there's no true standpoint that can be gained anywhere. And that's the kind of view that may or may not be adequately ascribed to someone like Richard Rorty in the analytic tradition or Michel Foucault, although some of Foucault's final lectures might suggest something a little more complicated than that. Or you might think like McIntyre or Bernard Williams or Charles Taylor that there is actually a truth to be known, even if we are all stuck within these traditions. So these are fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves that are going to be pivotal for how we negotiate these rival views about consciousness. This is going to be my last point in this section. There's another stand that has to be asked with respect to all these issues here, and that is, what's my stand on descriptions, explanations, causes, and ontology? So, do you presume from the outset there's a sort of descriptive, explanatory, or causal monism? In other words, there's only one, everything's in competition for a single competing causal slot. And what we're looking for is a story of one thing and one thing only, and that's going to provide the whole story. Or is there an account where there might be a plurality, not an infinite plurality, but a plurality of true descriptions, maybe a multitude of true explanations, that there's not a single causal slot, but there's multiple types of causality or difference-making factors or causal powers that are relevant. So already that's considerably different kinds of ontologies, and that's going to raise different questions about how you approach consciousness. Consciousness could be one kind of thing. It might be enabled by a set of neuroglial interconnections that are going on in the nervous system, but those themselves might depend upon a series of genetic mechanisms. Those also are all going to be related to a set of glucose metabolizing mechanisms, as well as things that have to do with an endocrine system and so on and so forth. Or is at the end of the day, there's only really one story to be told there, and all these other factors are either just redundant theoretical explanations, but not really doing any metaphysical work. And even within the pluralism, there's two different approaches. One would be a kind of complementary pluralism, where somehow we need to figure out how all these different levels of descriptions, explanations, and causes come together in a complementary way. Or a type of just fragmentary pluralism, where there is no unity of the sciences or the humanities, and they're just all these just different discourses and perspectives that we've adopted. So the third point I want to draw attention to is we also need to be careful about our liabilities for misunderstandings. Our different theoretical stances are helpful, but they can also lead others into misleading lines of inquiry. And to try to anticipate those can also help us clarify how to communicate our ideas. So you might ask, what's misleading or distorting misrepresentation, in my view, likely to generate? So ideas about folk psychology might be kind of helpful grab bags for talking efficiently in certain sort of psychological or cognitive science disciplines. But if folk psychology is more just a theoretical account of human beings rather than actually knowing what human beings think, like belief, desire, propositional attitude psychology is often called a kind of folk psychology. But if you did ethnographic work, you would not find too many people that think about their beliefs and desires in terms of propositional attitudes. It might be that that's a true theory about what human beings do, but it's not actually how folk think. And if you begin going around and asking them that way, and you set up your surveys that way, you're going to be causing them to distort actually what they think about themselves, and maybe even occluding from your experimental questions things that you really want to get access to. Here's one example from Joseph Ledoux, who's famous for his work on fear research in the amygdala. And he's been doing this research for almost 3 decades now. But Joe Ledoux recently, in 2014, this article, Coming to Terms with Fear, has recognized that his account of fear for his work in the amygdala has deeply misrepresented his research to others. He himself, by calling it fear research, has been misleading. And the ramifications for this are enormous. If you watch any of the fantastic documentaries on other animals that are out there, you'll hear people talking about how whales are way more emotional than human beings because they have a proportionally larger sized amygdala. And so they have more empathy than human beings, which might actually be true, but this research is based upon a trail of connections that's ultimately related to the research that Ledoux and others and his colleagues have done. But Ledoux here is coming out very clearly and saying, as he says here, the problem's not the terms, but with the way we use them. Specifically, problems arise when we conflate terms that refer to conscious experiences with those that refer to the processing of stimuli and control of responses, and assume that brain mechanisms that underlie the two kinds of processes are the same. By making mild changes that capture these distinctions, we have an easy fix that has the potential for eliminating much of the terminological confusion in the field. So he owns that calling what his research was fear research, and fear is an ordinary common sense term for emotion, he was misleading from what he now wants to call a threat detection system that's completely non-conscious, that occurs antecedently to any conscious awareness whatsoever. But now it's, they'll never completely overcome the kind of way in which the amygdala now is thought as the center for conscious awareness of fear, despite Ledoux not wanting that to have ever meant that, and now realizing his own way of describing this has led to these misrepresentations of his own research over the last 3 decades. So this is a kind of example of what I mean by being really careful about the metaphors and the terminology we use. They can be really helpful and really insightful, but they can also lead to a range of make our views vulnerable to misunderstandings that we never intended, and obfuscate a lot of issues that are just completely unnecessary if we had spent more time reflecting on them. So a final point I want to make before moving on to the last point of my paper, the 4th point of my paper, the last one, is one thing that's curious about humans is we don't just have a concept of consciousness, one theory of consciousness, which is also set within a nexus of all these other concepts that are psychological. We're a peculiar kind of being that has a range of different kinds of consciousness, and somehow we can try on and wear different psychological garments, so to speak, and live our lives with different ethical, normative, psychological ways of thinking about ourselves, types of self-help, types of religious and spiritual therapy, types of secular therapy. There are a lot of ranges of ways in which human beings have dealt with their existential problems of living and dying well. And what we need are theories that don't just try to tell us what's the best concept of consciousness, but a theory of consciousness or intelligence that can also make sense of the fact that humans have all these other rival conflicting views. So even if, say, a broadly neo-Humean view was the true view about the human mind, I'm also saying what the Humean needs to tell us now, if that is the true view of the human mind, how does the Humean mind also explain why there are people who are seriously concerned to show that Humean view is false? So how can we be the kind of creature that have a particular true view about what we are as conscious agents, but that true story also can explain why there are Platonists and Aristotelians and Avicennians and Averroists and Spinozians and Lockeans and functionalists and Husserlians? We don't just need to give one true story. We need to have the true story that can also explain how human beings are the peculiar kind of being that can adopt and take on all these other rival alternative concepts as well. And so what I think we need to do is try to re-envision. I'm not saying we need to tear down the whole edifice and build it up. That's impossible. We have a range of resources that are already available. We need to now occasionally ask a question of how do we rethink as plain persons already influenced by a range of different theories. How do we then ask questions about a critical theoretical ethic And this is why I'm saying this heuristic of no ontology or experimental operations without prior perspicuous phenomenology. So we need to think both about the virtues of adequate descriptions, descriptions that don't include or leave things out, but also be thinking seriously about theoretical parsimony, about simplicity, about not having too much. We need to have a sort of balancing act and try to find the right middle ground here between not an exaggerated parsimony where we only have a few things but end up distorting and leaving out of the picture a range of things. And of course we don't discover them because we aren't looking for them. But also not an adequate descriptive account that's way too expansive that there's no way we can get a handle on the range of different coordinates. So one thing to always ask oneself, I think, well, not always, but occasionally when you have a few spare moments, is the if I had discovered it test. So take a contentious theoretical claim, and this is an attempt to show all of us, myself included, how little we know. It's an attempt to get better self-knowledge, is take a contentious theoretical claim, or any claim for that matter, that you want to be committed to, and then try to tell a story about how you were raised, educated, and along with your colleagues, you arrived at the arguments or evidence that are purported to justify said theoretical claims. Now ask, is the contentious theoretical claim consistent with the practices of life and inquiry entailed by my story of its discovery? I mean, so most of the things that we are committed to, we wouldn't be able to tell this kind of story. And what we need to ask then is, to what degree do we depend on our colleagues, and how well would they be able to tell the story and fill in the other parts? And what does this contentious theoretical claim leave unexplained about me and the developing narratives of our interconnected lives? So there's a lot more I actually want to say about that point, but running with the clock, I'll move on. So this final section I want to talk about with no way of bringing together, so that point about the virtue of parsimony, that's going to have to come later. Now it's going to be an attempt to try to give you at least an adequate description of the range of rival views of consciousness without any effort to move forward and actually bringing them into some sort of parsimonious theoretical shape. First, we might want to make a distinction about consciousness, a distinction between intransitive and transitive consciousness. By intransitive consciousness, I mean being alert or awake rather than having a dreamless sleep. Whereas transitive consciousness encapsulates a range of words and concepts like awareness or attention or intentionality, of having a thought be about something or directed towards some object. Another factor, though, about consciousness, which raises questions about overly parsimonious accounts about it, is that it's polymorphic, it's many-formed. Consciousness has perceptual aspects of it that might be very different from somatic, from bodily feeling kind of aspects, which are different from affective agitations, emotions, moods, temperaments. Consciousness also involves things that we can be rationally reflective about, as well as we can be conscious of our actions, as well as the actions and behaviors of others. Consciousness can be memorative, it can be imaginative, and it can also be a type of self-awareness. And there's also a range of rival views about what the self is as we're aware of it, all the way from complete illusionary eliminativist views about the self to very substantive substance dualist accounts of the self. Some of you might have noticed recently in Daniel Dennett's, after his recent book was published, there was a brief debate between him and Strawson in, I think, the New York Review of Books, which would be worth going and just checking out that little debate. And that's a debate about whether or not consciousness involves qualia, this sort of qualitative experience or this sense of what it's like, or is consciousness some sort of illusion? But I think that this debate itself also excludes other views, because it might be that we can have consciousness and be consciousness realists, but we don't need to appeal to a type of sense of X or qualia or what it's like to be, or what it's like to be having a perception or having emotion. That there are other views of consciousness that don't go down the route of even needing qualia, but they're still very much realist accounts. A helpful debate book is this one, which was, the articles in this are based on the 2005 American Philosophical Association debate between Daniel Dennett, John Searle, and Peter Hacker, three rival views about consciousness who really, really deeply disagree with each other, and it's quite an entertaining debate too. And it's also not difficult to find an audio recording, which is even more entertaining, of the debate. But I just put this up here as a helpful work to work through and navigate some of these debates. We might also ask questions about introspection. some views of consciousness have consciousness as a kind of introspection that is a kind of inner feeling or perception. That's more along these qualia lines. But there are other people who think of introspection and consciousness just as a type of reflective thinking and not a kind of internal perception. So what we want to ask is, what are the more adequate accounts? When I think of consciousness as a sort of sense of self or a sense of this feeling or a feeling of what it's like, is that an adequate, helpful concept for articulating and describing consciousness? Or, as I'm kind of implicitly or explicitly gesturing towards, is it actually a kind of straitjacket? It's a problematic way of thinking about consciousness. We can still be realists about it, but not have to go in for that kind of language. Why have we adopted that language of consciousness as qualia or as a sense of self or what it's like? Maybe there are more adequate ways for thinking about it. Let's skip some of this. So I'll conclude with just a few more points here to be made about this. So here are three different kinds of views about self-consciousness that I want to briefly go over. One is a kind of metacognitive approach, that what it is to be self-conscious is to kind of have a perception of a perception or a reflection on a reflection. And some people might say, well, that's actually a legitimate description of one kind of phenomenon. We do reflect on ourselves, we can be aware of our awareness, but that's not the only kind of self-cognition that there is, or self-awareness. Others might want to frame it in terms of a foreground background, that one is always aware of oneself or subjectivity in the periphery of whatever focal awareness they have. And so you might have a kind of focal awareness or attention to one object as sort of object consciousness, but you're also always present as another object in the periphery. I think actually, in fact, Avicenna has this view in mind. But there's still a third view which thinks that there's a type of subject awareness that is always with object awareness, but it's not strictly intentional or object-oriented. And it would take quite a bit of conceptual therapy to make clear what exactly this view is. But it's just to draw attention to the fact there's not one clear view about what self-consciousness is. There are all these three rival views that one could help or work through. And I would look to this very nice book that was recently published by Dan Zahavi on Self and Other, who goes through both phenomenological and analytical accounts. All right. Anyhow, so I'll conclude with that there are a lot of disagreements about concepts of consciousness. And what I've tried to do is set up some anthropological considerations of ways in which you could think about how to navigate these conflicting concepts of consciousness, as well as to give some criteria, which are contestable, but some criteria you might work through is how you would continue using the resources you have so far to continue to affirm the kind of concepts of consciousness that one deploys, or realize that there are limitations to the account one has provided so far, and what resources you might look elsewhere to try to improve and revise one's best account of what consciousness is so far. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.